So today we're going to talk about Easter Island. Are y'all familiar, Betty? What do you think about when you hear Easter Island? But when you see the pictures of the giant heads, what do you see? It's usually big open fields, right? You don't see jungle. Easter Island, before people got there, looked like Hawaii. It had rainforests and trees and palms. It had huge palms, some of the largest palms that were ever known, and they're all gone. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened. And keep in mind that the archaeology has changed our ideas about Easter Island quite a bit. And I tried to reflect that in the PowerPoint, and I'll talk about some of the things as we go through. But anyway, I'm going to do a PowerPoint. You have the guided notes if you want to use those as you follow along. And I'm going to go ahead and start it now. Oh, maybe I can do it this way. Okay, can y'all see the PowerPoint? Owen, you're okay, yeah, okay. For some reason let me see if I can change this. There we go, now I can see more of you. Okay, so Easter Island. It's not, obviously the people that lived there at first did not call it Easter Island, they called it Rapa Nui. It's a very remote Pacific island, 2,250 kilometers from the nearest inhabited island. And it was named because it was discovered on Easter Sunday by a Dutch explorer, Jacob Roggeveen, or something to that effect. There we are. I had people in the waiting room again. Okay, so very remote island, not very close to any of the other South Pacific islands. And here's what it looks like. Of course, you see the giant heads and grasslands. That's what pretty much the whole island looks like. Originally, it was uninhabited, 160 square kilometers. I need to convert these to miles so they make sense to us, but it was settled pretty late. Only by 1200 AD did the Polynesian settlers get there. So in historical times was when people first got there. Estimates say there were no more than about 100 people, and it was covered with large palm trees and at least 17 species of trees. They know this. They've done a lot of the research when we talk about when things were wiped out. They can study pollen that's found in lake sediments. So there's a lake, and they can take core samples of the mud, and people, believe it or not, whose expertise is identifying ancient pollen grains. So there are people that can look at a sample of mud from 1,000 years ago and look at the pollen grains and figure out what kind of plants were around that lake. So that's how we know a lot of this information. Let me just check something real quick. Okay. All right, so this was more like the tropical islands you see in Moana and other TV shows, you know, jungle. It was a tropical paradise, and it was colonized about 1200 AD. Here's one of the lakes that where they get the core samples. So what was there originally? There were lots of trees that I can't pronounce the names of, woody shrubs, herbs, ferns, grasses, palm trees, 82-foot tall, 6-foot wide palm trees, if you can imagine that. These are not the ones you see around Las Vegas and stuff. These were huge palm trees. These were the primary producers, which represent sources of food, energy, timber, rope, and fuel. They made their rope from the barks of trees. They built their houses from trees. They built their canoes from trees. There were seabirds, lots of different species, albatrosses, boobies, frigate birds, tropic birds, petrels, terns, Lots of different kinds of birds nested on the island. It's aquatic resources. There's fish, dolphins, seal, shellfish. Now, unlike some of the other tropical islands, South Pacific islands, there wasn't a lagoon. There's no lagoon. So they had, the water depth dropped off very quickly. So it wasn't like in a lot of the islands, you can just go into the lagoon, it's protected, and you can harvest a lot of stuff in shallow water. They didn't have that. So the water dropped off deep, very deep. It got deep very quickly, and you had to have a way to get offshore. There were land birds, owls, like barn owls. Barn owls are kind of cool. Just a little tangent. Barn owls are found almost all over the world. We have them here, and you have the same species in Europe, and they had them on Easter Island. Herons, parrots, rails, which are kind of a small heron type bird. And just a real quick introduction to the types of resources. Perpetual resources like solar energy are continuously renewed. Wind, you're not going to run out. You're not going to use it up. Renewable is a resource that can be replenished fairly rapidly, anywhere from hours to decades, in a human lifetime, basically, through natural processes. Non-renewable are resources that exist in a fixed amount in various places in the Earth crust and has the potential to be renewed up by geological, physical, and chemical processes taking hundreds of millions to billions of years. So, like fossil fuels are probably still being made, but it's going to take millions of years to make more. Potentially renewable, these are resources that can be replenished fairly rapidly, again, hours to several decades through natural processes, unless you use them faster than they're replenished. It can be converted into a non-renewable resource. So forests grow back, but if you cut the whole forest down, it's not renewable anymore, it's gone. Soil takes a long time to be made. You can use soil, you can fertilize it, and make it a renewable resource if you don't use it all. But if it erodes away, it's gone, and it's going to take thousands of years to get new soil. So that's potentially renewable. And that's going to be very important in our discussion here. Okay, so the settlers got there, and they didn't come alone. They brought things with them. They brought livestock, chickens and pigs, and they brought some crops, sweet potatoes, other things like that. They began to cut down the palm trees to build houses and dug out canoes for fuel. And they used their boats. Believe it or not, they ate a lot of dolphins, which I can't imagine how they did that. They're fast. It would be very difficult to hunt dolphins, but they did. They know this from excavating the bones in their trash heaps. They call them middens. And they can date the middens, and they can see what they were eating by looking at the bones. Some of these things became invasive species. Chickens, rats, and sugarcane. There were no rats on Easter Island, but there were rats on some of their other places the Easter Islanders came from. And rats stow away on boats almost all the time, even the canoes that they used. And they may have brought them on purpose because they ate rats. And anyway, the rats were brought and became an invasive species. Sugarcane as well. So let's think about rats for a minute. Rats can double their population in 47 days. In 3 years, if you started out with 2 rats, you could have a population of 17 million rats. And the rats ate the seedlings of plants as well as their seeds. None of these plants were used to rats. The seabirds either. Rats will eat eggs, and they'll also eat baby birds. So ground nesting birds have a big problem. So rats are a scourge to islands. They're really bad. Okay, so between 1200 and 1500 AD, about 300 years, is when these statues were made. And again, this is what we think about when we think about Easter Island. Huge statues weighing several tons, and they didn't build them on site. They had to move them a couple of miles usually. There were lots of them. They were sculpted in the sides of the mountains and moved 14 kilometers to shore, so roughly about 7 miles. The first ones are 8 to 10 feet high, and they use them as ways to compete with the neighboring clans. So there's between 200 completed statues and 700 incomplete statues. They stood as high as 33 feet tall and weighed up to 82 tons. There's incomplete statues that stood as high as 65 feet and weighed as much as 270 tons. So these, and again, they had to be transported by a Stone Age civilization. No metal tools, no pulleys. It's mind-boggling to think that how they were able to do that. Why did they build them? Interestingly enough, you would think they would face out to sea, but they didn't. They faced into shore. And it's believed they were to attract the gods to protect Rapa Nui. They built bigger moai, that's what they called them, over time to show their power and wealth over the other clans. It's like keeping up with the Joneses. You know, if someone, your neighbor puts in a swimming pool and you want to put in a bigger one, or they put in a garden, you want to make a nicer one. They were competing with the clans this way. If one of them put up a 20-foot tall statue, you wanted to put up a 30-foot tall one with the stone cap on top, things like that. And this is how they believe they moved them. They went a long time trying to figure out how they moved. And when they asked the natives how they got there, they said they walked. And this comes out, this is what they meant. They didn't mean they just got up and walked. This is how they got there. But you need rope to do this. Used to, they thought they needed lots and lots and lots of wood to make rollers and sleds and all kinds of things. And now it turns out they didn't need quite as much infrastructure and quite as many people to move the statues as they thought. But you still need rope. And rope comes from trees. If you don't have trees, you don't have rope. Pollen analysis shows a decrease in plant populations and species diversity over time, and the population grew. By the year 1500, 300 years after they had colonized the island, they believe there are between 10,000 and 20,000 people. That's a pretty big estimate, but again, you're doing archaeology, and it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how many people were from that. But that's their estimate. That's a lot of people for an island that size, so it could support them. So what went wrong? Why does it look like this now? By 1400, just 200 years, the palm and the other trees and shrubs were gone. You'll hear that word extirpated a lot. It means they're not necessarily, it's different from extinct. Extinct means there's no more anywhere on the planet. Extirpated means they're not in that area anymore. There's some grouse, a type of bird, that are in Colorado. They used to be here in New Mexico. And if you look at a list of birds in New Mexico, they'll say this bird was extirpated. They're no longer in that area, in our area. So in 200 years, the trees were gone. And used to, they thought people just cut them all down. And then the soil eroded, and they cut things down as they grew. But now we believe that there was more to it than that. The rats were the big problem. The rats scavenged palm nuts and other fruit and seeds, prevented the regeneration of the critical primary producers for food, fuel, wood, fiber, and timber for canoes. So yes, the people cut down the trees, and the trees died of old age. 200 years is a pretty good age for most trees, especially in the tropics. And the rats didn't let any new ones grow. There were so many rats, they ate all the baby trees. So once you cut them down, or once the tree died of old age, it didn't get replaced. And that's why the island looks like this. Eventually all the trees were cut down and only grasses remained. Without the rope, you can't make any more statues. They actually have, they can see the areas where they made the statues, and there are unfinished statues still there. It's like they made the statues and then they couldn't move them. So what does it mean for there to be no trees? Trees hold on to the soil. So without the trees, you have soil erosion. With soil erosion, you lose crops and you lose food. The birds that were nesting in the trees or under the trees, they're not going to be there. So that's a decrease in food and diversity. The big thing about living on an island and not having trees is you have no more boats. Without boats, they couldn't catch the dolphins, the porpoises. So that's another source of meat they lost. They couldn't fish and they couldn't leave. That's what's scary to me, is they're on this island. They've been there for a couple of 100 years, and now the island can't really support them very well anymore, but they can't leave because there's no more boats. And it's not like in Moana on the tropics where they have these boats that have been in a cave and lasted for 1,000 years just sitting there. Wood rots in the tropics. You don't have boats lasting 1,000 years. No fuel for cooking, heating, and no replacement houses. So they started living in caves. Now this is where the controversy comes up in the archaeology record of what exactly happened at this point. So by 1500, 300 years after they got there, the land and seabirds are all gone. So that's another source of food that's gone. The forest is totally gone. There's actually an offshore island from Easter Island that has seabirds, and there's a competition. It was like over a mile away, I think. There's a competition every year to see who can swim over there, get some eggs, and bring them back. And it's a competition, and it's a dangerous competition. It's a long swim. Okay, so potentially renewable resources became non-renewable. With no roots from vegetation to anchor the soils, they eroded into the sea. Without the soil and the plants, the streams and springs started to dry up because the water didn't soak into the ground and go into an aquifer. It just ran off into the ocean. Crop yields decreased until there was no more arable land, farmable land. So consequences were starvation, fighting over food, cannibalism, the social order collapsed, and a massive die-off, down to 2,000 people when the Europeans arrived. This is where a lot of people argue. The newer archaeological studies show that this massive die-off didn't really happen, and the people survived, and they survived on other things, not nearly as well, but they did survive, and you didn't have this huge crash in population until the Europeans arrived. And when the Europeans arrived, the things that typically happen when the Europeans got in contact with Aboriginal civilizations, diseases, there were plagues, they were kidnapped for slavery in South America, lots of things like that. So like I said, disagreements. Some archaeologists think they coped with deforestation and loss of food types with no drop in population until the Europeans introduced diseases and kidnapped them. Different archaeologists argue about this. Some of them say, oh, but there was definitely a drop from 20,000 to 2,000 before the Europeans got there. Other people say, no, they were doing just fine. Well, maybe not just fine, but they were surviving. Whatever the exact details, there's no doubt that the ecosystem was devastated by the arrival of the humans. The forest could not survive a combination of trees being cut down for lumber and rats eating most or all the seeds and seedlings. Whether the human population crashed with the ecosystem, their standard of living definitely dropped. They started making statues, and I should put a picture on this of it looked like the other statues, but they were carved out of wood for one thing, small pieces of wood, and they were emaciated. They were starving. So they had statues, they had carvings of starving people. their standard of living definitely dropped. They went from eating all kinds of types of meat, all kinds of different types of plants, to a very restricted diet. Their various sources of meat were reduced to basically rats and chickens. We get kind of grossed out by the thought of eating rats, but they probably ate rats even before they came. Lots of cultures around the world eat rats. They don't all, most people don't have the taboo that we do against eating rats and things like that. Actually, and we'll talk about this more later, the Western civilization has a very strange idea of meat. If you eat something other than cows and chickens and pigs, and maybe fish, maybe goats, but even goats are kind of weird, you get looked at weird. People think strange things about you if you eat things other than those couple of different species. When I lived in the Houston area, we raised our own food, and we ate goats and we ate rabbits. We raised rabbits to eat. And when I told people that, they would look at us kind of weird. You eat rabbits? What's wrong? What's wrong with you? But they're perfectly good sources of meat. There's lots of animals that you can eat that don't taste that bad if you're used to them, but because of our restricted diet, we've got to come to where if it's not a cow or a chicken or a pig, we don't want to eat it. I've been to potlucks before where a hunter had made a stew with venison, and someone was eating it. So, what is this? And when they told them it was deer, they almost threw up. I mean, you could see that in their face. They almost threw up because they were eating deer. There's nothing wrong with deer meat. But anyway, that's a little aside. But I personally rats wouldn't be my first choice of a meal, but they do have, lots of people eat them. So, and here's the scariest thing to me about the whole Easter Island thing, is it's not like they, things started getting bad, so, well, we'll just go back where we came from or find somewhere else to live. They couldn't leave because they couldn't make boats anymore. They were stuck on this very small island that had been ecologically devastated. They were stuck. Some people think that we need to take this as a lesson because it's going to be a long time before we can leave the planet. And so we need to think of our planet as an Easter Island. Anyway. Okay, so that's the Easter Island story. It's not quite as good an environmental story as it used to be because of new archaeological discoveries, but it was still, no matter how you look at it, whether the population crashed or not, the people were not living nearly as good as their ancestors. They were eating just a couple of types of food. They didn't have houses to live in. They were living in caves. And Easter Island is one of the cooler islands than the other ones. And something that's important to know, and I just read a book about this, it's not because the Easter Islanders were worse about taking care of their land than the people in Hawaii or Tonga and things like that. The island was more fragile than the other South Pacific islands, and they didn't know that. They had no way of knowing that. They went there and they started living like they had where they came from. But for several different reasons that we won't really go into, for one, it's not as warm, doesn't get as much rain. There's still a jungle, so they still get a lot more rain than we do, but not as much as the other islands. Because of where they're located, they don't get as much dust from Asia or as much volcanic ash from falling, which fertilizes the land. There were a lot of things that came together to make Easter Island more fragile than the other islands. So a lot of the stories were that the Easter Islanders got there and they didn't take care of their land and they were bad stewards and they made all kinds of bad decisions that destroyed the ecosystem. It really wasn't their fault. The island, they weren't worse than the other islanders. It's just that their island was more fragile. And so that's something you have to take into account. There's lots of things like that. Greenland, the Vikings just colonized Greenland, and they tried to live on Greenland like they had lived in Norway. And Greenland was a much more fragile, much more much less easy to live place than Norway was, and it didn't work. And they stayed there for several hundred years, and then they all starved to death. So, and it's because they destroyed the ecosystem. And it's not because they were stupid. They did worse things than they did in Norway. They were just treating it like it was Norway, and it wasn't. So we'll see that a lot in different civilizations, and it's kind of interesting to look into.